In football, the biggest stories are usually written by the biggest clubs. The ones with the brightest stadium lights, the largest budgets, and the global audiences that follow them every weekend. But sometimes the course of football history shifts in places where nobody expects it. Far away from the spotlight. In the early 2000s, something unusual was happening in a quiet Belgian town called Beveren. It wasn't a football capital, nor a glamorous destination for international players. It was simply a small town with a modest stadium known as a Vreethiel, surrounded by houses, narrow streets, and a community that had supported the same club for generations. And yet, for a few remarkable years, that stadium became the entry point to European football for a generation of African talent. Young players began arriving from Ivory Coast, most of them unknown to the wider football world. They were teenagers, full of potential but still far from the global stage. Among them was a tall, composed midfielder whose career had barely begun. His name was Yaya Touré. Long before he would lift the Champions League trophy, dominate midfields in England, and became one of the most celebrated African players of his era, Touré first stepped onto a European pitch in the colours of SK Beveren. For a brief moment in time, this small Belgian club became something extraordinary. A bridge between continents, a place where unknown talents from West Africa could begin their journey in European football. But football rarely stands still. This experiment that once made Beveren famous slowly faded away, and the club that had once changed careers of future stars gradually disappeared from the center of Belgium game. For years, Beveren lived mostly in memory. Until now. Because more than 2 decades after those remarkable days, something new is happening at the Vreethiel. This season, Beveren had returned to the top of the Challenger Pro League with extraordinary dominance, securing the title months before the season even finished and remained undefeated along the way. To understand how a small Belgian club could influence football across continents, we had to go back to the beginning. Welcome to Hidden Club Stories, where every club carries a story. This is the story of SK Beveren. This episode is sponsored by Hidden Shirt Club. They sell football shirt mystery boxes with the real stories. Long before the arrival of African talents and international attention, Beveren was simply a small provincial club trying to carve out its place in Belgian football. The town itself had never been associated with sporting powerhouses. Situated in East Flanders, Beveren was known far more for its industry and its working class communities than for football glory. Yet within that modest setting, a club slowly began to grow. During the 1970s, something remarkable happened, against all expectations. Beveren started competing with the biggest teams in Belgium. Clubs from large cities such as Brussels and Antwerp suddenly found themselves challenged by a team from a town of barely 30,000 people. Under the guidance of a legendary coach, Urbain Brahms, Beveren developed a style built on discipline, organization and collective strength. What followed felt almost surreal. In 1979, Beveren won the Belgian Championship for the first time. 5 years later, in 1984, they did it again. For a brief but unforgettable period, the Vreethiel Stadium became one of the most feared venues in Belgian football. The success of those years transformed the club's identity. Beveren was no longer just a provincial outsider. It had proven that even a small town could challenge the traditional hierarchy of Belgian football. But the decades that followed would prove far more complicated. Football evolves constantly, and clubs that once dominated can quickly find themselves struggling to keep pace. By the 1990s, Belgian football was changing. Financial disparities between clubs were growing, and maintaining success required resources that smaller teams often lacked. Beveren slowly drifted away from the top of the league. The club remained respected for its history, but it was no longer competing for titles. Instead, it fought to maintain stability in a football landscape that was becoming increasingly professionalized. For supporters who had witnessed the glory years of the 70s and the 80s, This period felt uncertain. The Vreedhiel still failed on match days, but the sense of inevitability that once surrounded the club had disappeared. Few could have predicted that the next transformation of Beveren would come from a place thousands of kilometers away. At the end of the 90s, a French football visionary named Jean-Marc Gilloux began to search for a pathway that could bring young African players into European football. Gilloux had established an academy in Abidjan, Ivory Coast, where he was developing a generation of highly technical players who had grown up playing football barefoot in the streets. But talent alone was not enough. These players needed a bridge to Europe. That bridge became Beveren. Through a partnership between the club and the academy, young Ivorians began arriving in Belgium, often as teenagers, taking their first steps into professional football. What followed was unlike anything European football had seen before. Instead of a traditional Belgian squad, Beveren suddenly fielded a team dominated by African players. Among them were names that would later become famous across the world: Yaya Touré, Emmanuel Eboué, and Gervinho. For a while, the Vreedhiel became a laboratory for a new idea in football development. Young African players were no longer forced to rely on chances encountering with European scouts. Instead, they had a structured pathway to the professional game. And for a small Belgian club hosting them, the project brought international attention that few could have imagined. The team that had emerged from this partnership was fascinating to watch. The players were technically gifted, fearless in possession, and often far younger than their opponents. Their style of play felt different from the more physical football typically associated with Belgium at the time, but the project also attracted controversy. Some critics questioned whether Beveren had become too dependent on foreign players, while others wondered whether the club had sacrificed its identity in pursuit of a bold experiment. For the supporters, however, the experience was unforgettable. They watched young players who would later shine in Europe take their first steps in the yellow and blue of Beveren. And on certain nights, it felt as if the small stadium in East Flanders had become a window into football's future. Yet, like many ambitious projects in football, the experiment could not last forever. By the late 2000s, the partnership that had transferred Beveren began to unravel. The club struggled to maintain financial stability, and the pipeline of African talents slowly dried up. Without the momentum of the earlier years, Beveren found itself fighting once again against relegation. Eventually, the club dropped out of Belgium's top division. For supporters who had witnessed both the championship years and the African Revolution, the decline felt painful. But even in the lower leagues, the identity of the club remained intact. The Vreedhiel was still there, the supporters still came, and the belief that Beveren could rise again never completely disappeared. For years, Beveren existed somewhere between memory and ambition. The club still carried its history, the titles of the 70s, the African Revolution of the early 2000s, but those moments felt increasingly distant. Season after season passed, without the kind of success that could truly change the direction of the club. Until this year. At the start of the season, expectations around SK Beveren were cautious rather than explosive. The club had assembled a competitive squad, but Belgian football has seen many teams start strong before fading away. What followed, however, was something far more remarkable. Week after week, Beveren simply refused to lose. Matches that seemed destined for draws turned into late victories. Difficult away games became statements of control, and slowly, almost quietly, a pattern began to emerge. Beveren were not just winning, they were dominating the league. By the time spring arrived, the numbers had become impossible to ignore. The club that had already secured the title in the Challenger Pro League months before the season even finished, an achievement that rarely happens in professional football. Even more impressive was the way they did it. Match after match, Beveren remained unbeaten. In a league where every team eventually stumbles, they simply kept moving forward. One statistic in particular illustrates just how unusual this season has been. Throughout the entire campaign, Beveren received only one single penalty in their favor. For many clubs, penalties can change the course of a season. They provide easy goals, moments of relief, when matches become difficult. Beveren had almost none of that. Their dominance came from open play, from structure, from consistency. From a team that learned how to control games rather than survive them. Inside the club, people began to realize that they were witnessing something rare. Not just a promotion, but a season that supporters would remember for decades. The Vreedhiel, a stadium that had seen glory and disappointment in equal measure, suddenly felt alive again. Older supporters recognized something familiar in the atmosphere, the sense that the club was once again moving forward, that the long years of uncertainty were finally giving way to something new. And within the club's leadership, figures like Bob Peters played an important role in guiding that transformation. Peters, a well-known name in Belgian football, helped shape a project built on stability rather than short-term ambition. The goal was never simply promotion, it was rebuilding the identity of the club, slowly, carefully. And now, after years of searching for direction, the results are finally visible on the pitch. Because this season has shown something that Beveren supporters always believed but rarely had the chance to prove. That this club is still capable of writing new chapters, not only remembering the past, but adding to it. For more than a century, SK Beveren has lived exactly there, somewhere between memory and possibility. A club remembered for its glory in the 70s, for the remarkable moments when young players of Ivory Coast arrived in a small Belgian town and began their journeys would eventually take them to the biggest stages in world football. For the first European steps of players like Yaya Touré. For years, those memories were the story people told about Beveren. But this season has reminded everyone of something important. History is not only something you inherit, sometimes it is something you write again. Because today, the Vreedhiel is alive once more. The stands feel alive. The club that once connected continents is finding its way forward again. Not through nostalgia, but through a new generation writing its own chapter. And maybe that is the most beautiful part of football. That even in a small stadium, in a town far away from the spotlight, a story can begin again. Thank you for watching this episode of Hidden Club Stories. If you want to discover more clubs with identity, history and soul, make sure to subscribe. Because somewhere out there, another story is already waiting.